New developments this morning in the Russia investigation. Sources tell CNN that special counsel Robert Mueller has interviewed top Trump aide Stephen Miller. This is the first sign that Mueller's Russia probe has entered President Trump's inner circle. Sources say Miller was questioned about his role in writing a draft of a memo explaining the firing of FBI Director James Comey.
CNN has also learned that Mr. Trump's former security chief, Keith Schiller, told House investigators this week that he rejected a Russian offer to send 5 women to then businessman Trump's hotel room during a 2013 trip to Moscow. Schiller told investigators he took the offer as a joke. Okay, let's get a check on CNN Money Stream this morning. Doubts over U.S. tax reform, that's rocking markets. Global stocks and U.S. futures are lower this morning. And on Wall Street yesterday, the Dow fell more than 100 points to end a 5-day record streak. The House and Senate introduced competing tax plans, and investors are worried about how tax reform is going to wind up shaking out, particularly that the Senate plans to delay corporate tax cuts, delay it till 2019. Economic advisor Gary Cohn says every CEO is excited about corporate tax cuts, but one business leader isn't cheering. Starbucks chairman Howard Schultz is actually slamming the GOP tax plan, calling it fool's gold, explaining that it's too heavily skewed toward cuts instead of much-needed reform, and that corporate America does not need the proposed corporate tax cut to 20%. Schultz, of course, is a well-known Democrat. He stepped down as the CEO of Starbucks this year, but many have been speculating for quite some time that Schultz is considering a run for office.
Not just office, the highest office in the land.
I wouldn't doubt it if he does.
Those comments would mean more if he was still the CEO of Starbucks.
I think he still carries weight.
Yeah, no doubt. It is just clear. Both sides, though, used to believe in corporate tax being lowered. Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama
there are
used
lots
to
of
believe
loopholes
that.
that corporate America uses.
Yeah, it's going to be a bruising tax fight ahead, no doubt.
All right, thanks for joining us. I'm Allison Kosick.
I'm Dave Briggs. New Day starts right now. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week.
Have a good weekend.
These women agreed to speak publicly to show Alabama voters that there's another side to Roy Moore.
If the Moore allegations are true, the president thinks he'll step aside.
The Washington Post that dropped that dime on Trump, dropped the dime on Judge Roy Moore. Is that a coincidence?
This was his first project, and it has blown up on the Republican Party.
If he continues to stand, the chances of the Democrats picking up that seat go up considerably.
The White House telling reporters the president will not hold a formal sit-down with Vladimir Putin.
The Kremlin spokesman said there would be a meeting.
Russia clearly involved itself to change the American election. Leads up to the question, is there a crime committed?
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is New Day. It's Friday, November 10th, 6 o'clock here in New York, and here is our starting line. President Trump and Republican lawmakers are calling on Roy Moore, the GOP's nominee for Alabama's Senate seat, to withdraw from the race if allegations of sexual misconduct with several underage girls are true. Remember, an allegation is a suggestion without proof. You do have proof here. You have multiple women saying that it happened. That is an accusation. It raises the question, does what these women say matter? The Washington Post is calling the report a desperate political attack, vowing to never give up the fight. That's what Roy Moore is saying, according to the Washington Post. This explosive set of charges unfolding 1 month before a special election. The GOP's narrow majority in the Senate hangs in the balance, but this is about some bigger issues than just an election. You have to remember, politically, Roy Moore is Steve Bannon's latest soldier in his war against the establishment. So he has no loyalty to listen to the party's leaders, and Bannon and his like at Breitbart are strongly supporting Moore, even in the face of these suggestions.
And then on the other side of the globe, all eyes today on President Trump and what was supposed to be his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. The White House now says there will be no formal meeting, but they did not rule out an informal sideline encounter. The Kremlin says it's getting contradictory signals. And a CNN exclusive on Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. CNN has learned that the special counsel has interviewed White House senior policy advisor Stephen Miller about his role in the firing of FBI Director James Comey. There is a lot to cover. So let's begin with CNN's Martin Savage. He is live in Gadsden, Alabama. What's the latest?
Morning, Allison. You know, the allegations now that have been leveled against Roy Moore, the candidate here, come as a shock on two fronts. One, just what is being alleged here. And then on top of that, the timing, just weeks before this very critical Senate election. And they all go back to the courthouse here behind me here, where Roy Moore was then an assistant DA. The Trump administration responding to the bombshell allegations that Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore sexually molested a 14-year-old girl over 30 years ago, with a nod to both Moore's conservative supporters.
The president believes that we cannot allow a mere allegation, in this case one from many years ago, to destroy a person's life.
And establishment Republicans like Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
However, the president also believes that if these allegations are true, Judge Moore will do the right thing and step aside.
McConnell saying Thursday that if the allegations are true, Moore must step aside. Concerns echoed by a growing list of Republicans on Capitol Hill.
If they're true, he should step aside.
If that's true, I don't believe there'd be any place for him in the U.S. Senate.
But Moore is digging in, denying the charges and blaming the, quote, Obama-Clinton machine's liberal media lapdogs for the vicious and nasty round of attacks, and vowing to never give up the fight. President Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, standing by Moore, whom he championed during the primaries, comparing the timing of the Washington Post report to the release of the Access Hollywood tapes just before the 2016 election.
Now, is that a coincidence? That's what I mean when I say opposition party.
Lee Corfman says she was 14 years old when she was approached by Moore outside a courtroom in 1979. He was a 32-year-old assistant district attorney. Corfman says he offered to stay with her while her mother went inside for a hearing. She says that Moore got her phone number and later took her to his house on 2 separate occasions.
On one of the occasions, undressed her, undressed himself, and, touched her over her bra and underwear, and guided her to touch him over his underwear.
She said she was uncomfortable after that incident and asked Moore to take her home, but never reported troubling stories about Moore in recent weeks, telling the Washington Post that Moore pursued them when they were between the ages of 16 and 18, while he was in his 30s, but none alleged forceful sexual contact. Moore, a devout Christian, is no stranger to controversy, remarking just this year that he thinks that the September 11th attacks was God's punishment for America's lack of morality, and telling a reporter in a 2005 interview that homosexuality should be illegal.
Just because it's done behind closed doors, it can still be prohibited by state law. Do you know that bestiality, the relationship between man and beast, is prohibited in every state?
Moore is maintaining that this is nothing more than just a dirty tricks kind of political action just weeks before this critical vote. But conservative Christians that I've talked to here have said they don't see this so much as politics. They see it as a matter of faith. This is a man who has wrapped himself very closely and clearly to a deep Christian abiding faith. If the allegations are true, they say, he needs to come forward even before the election and confess. That's if they're true. Allison and Chris.
Now, Martin, there's a real complicating factor here, not to separate the moral issues at play here and potential legal issues, but even if he withdraws, I think under state law there, his name stays on the ballot. So if they were going to put in a write-in candidate, he's going to siphon off, he's going to split the ticket effectively. So they would have problems there no matter which way Mr. Moore decides to respond to this. Martin, thank you very much for the reporting. So what are the Republicans in Washington doing over this? Well, there's obviously a lot of stunned faces, but most are saying that Moore should step aside if the allegations are true. This is big for Republicans because their party only has a narrow majority in the Senate. Him not being in the race, him presumed to have a very good chance to win, could put that slim margin at risk. CNN's Brianna Keeler live on Capitol Hill with more. They're in a box because the idea of saying, well, if it's true, he should step away. When women say that something happened, that has to be considered more than an empty allegation, something that needs so much further proof. So they're in a box here in terms of how to judge this, Brianna.
Well, they are, and they don't have all the control over this. My read on what Republicans are saying is that they really do not want Roy Moore there, and they don't want to be talking about this. They want to be talking about their tax reform plans that they unveiled yesterday, that this story completely hijacked, as they're already facing really difficult political headwinds, which was made so apparent on Tuesday Tuesday night as Democrats swept mayoral, gubernatorial, and state legislative races. Here's a look at how some Republicans were responding to this.
Thank you, everyone. Senator McConnell, do you believe that women who made these accusations against Roy Moore? Leader McConnell, do you believe these women made on-the-record accusations against Roy Moore, sir?
Thank you,
Let's go, guys. Leader McConnell.
On taxes, can you guarantee that no one
Here, Chris and Allison, how uncomfortable Republicans are. And yes, Mitch McConnell has said if this is true, Roy Moore should step aside. But pay attention to what his former chief of staff has said. And this is something that Josh Holmes would not be saying without the blessing of the McConnell camp. He said that this is what happens when, quote, reckless, incompetent idiots like Steve Bannon recruit candidates. So the feeling from so many Republicans is that these women are credible. You look at the Washington Post story, they are Republicans, some of them Trump Republicans. A pattern is established. And so even though you have this if true caveat, there are also members like Senator McCain who dropped the if true caveat. The reality, though, is that when it comes to Senate Republicans, they are not so much in control. The voters of Alabama are in control. The GOP party in Alabama is in control because either Roy Moore steps aside, which seems unlikely at this point, or the state party asks the Secretary of State there to invalidate his nomination. Only after that, if Roy Moore were to come to the Senate, then would they have to hit a very high 2/3 vote bar to get rid of him. So it's really up to voters in Alabama and the party there. Chris and Allison?
It is complicated. Brianna, thank you very much for all of that reporting. Here to talk more about it is CNN political analysts Karin Demersion and David Drucker. We also have the managing producer of Reckon by AL.com, John Hammontree. John, I want to start with you because you're on the ground there in Birmingham, Alabama. So what's been the response to this bombshell?
It's definitely been a mixed bag. We've seen Governor Ivey, even before these accusations came out, she said that she was planning to vote for Roy Moore, but would not go so far as to endorse him. But then you're seeing from the state auditor, Jim Ziegler, who ironically led the crusade against Governor Bentley last year over that sex scandal. He said this is much ado about very little. He made comparisons to biblical figures like Mary and Joseph.
And John, sorry to interrupt you, but we have that, and I think that it's just really instructive. So let me just read that for you, what you're referring to. So this is the Alabama State Auditor, Jim Ziegler, saying there's nothing to see here. The allegations are that a man in his early 30s dated teenage girls. Even the Washington Post report says he never had sexual intercourse with any of the girls and never attempted sexual intercourse. Take Joseph and Mary. Mary was a teenager, and Joseph was an adult carpenter. They became parents of Jesus. There's just nothing immoral or illegal here. Maybe just a little bit unusual.
Well, you have a 14-year-old who says that he took her back to his house and touched her. That would be an assault. The age of legal consent in Alabama is 16.
Yeah.
So there's a certain aspect of legality here, but also just what do you make of that, of trying to make a reference to Mary and Joseph for what we're seeing with Roy Moore? You talk about cheapening a biblical premise.
Well, and the whole premise of the Mary and Joseph story is that she was a virgin, so I'm not entirely sure what he was going with there. Yeah, it's disturbing in a way that I don't think happens very often here in local politics. Typically, you would think, we have very strict laws in terms of teachers interacting with students, that children are off limits. There's been some mental gymnastics by party leaders here in the state. Some have said, even if the allegations are true, that they would still vote for him because it's better than voting for a Democrat. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be the case for rank and file voters. I think even prior to these accusations, you were seeing that this race is going to be much tighter than Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump.
Well, he was very controversial before this. I mean, we've had him on the show talking about this man's tendency, even when an elected officer of the law, the chief of the Supreme Court down there, to put his reckoning of his faith before the U.S. Constitution. And a lot of this pushback we're hearing reminds of what I was hearing on your special last night on the town hall. Well, this happened a long time ago. You know, he was only in his 30s then. Right. You know, and look, I mean, they're saying it, but we don't know if it's true. I mean, these are dangerous aspects of dialogue.
Yeah, yes, but it does feel, Karin, as though something has shifted in the past month where it's no longer being called he said, she said. suddenly we see these things in a different
Although
way.
they are McConnell, if
no,
true.
I know that they're trying, but I just am saying that it's a different landscape than it was even a few months ago.
Yeah, I mean, look, this would have been a story anyway. It's more of a story because we are in the post-Weinstein era. It's more of a story also because the GOP just doesn't like Roy Moore very much. But yes, we are in a different climate right now where you're seeing new high-profile figures be exposed on a weekly basis, more than a weekly basis, frankly, for sexual assaults against various women. When it's young women who are children, that's even more horrifying because that is just something that pretty much there's universal disgust on that front. I think most people who have ever parented or a 14-year-old period would argue that that's just a normal thing for somebody in his mid-30s to be hitting on a teenager.
Touching.
I'm sorry. That's right. You're absolutely right. This is touching. This, like as you said, goes into the assault category. So. To invoke the religious reference is seems like a little bit of a dog whistle to his followers. Remember, I'm your, Christian candidate. Don't listen to what they're trying to say about me. But this is directly, it's kind of hypocritical to do that right now when you're trying to avoid accusations that are fundamentally based on, in one instance, criminality, but in the other instance is morality. And then to invoke this sort of moral thing, that's not working so much anymore in this era because we are a lot more woke to that sort of thing, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. As a society, we are
and this is
just
all
accepting women's
on,
words.
Is the morality issues.
So David Drucker,
it's not.
So sorry, John, but I just want to get David in because I know that you spent time covering his race. You were in Alabama, and then fast forward to looking at Mitch McConnell there in that awkward presser where they're smiling, they're trying to shoo away the press. This is not what they need.
It's not what they need. It's not what they want. And let's remember, Mitch McConnell, through his super PAC, spent almost $10 million to try and defeat Roy Moore in that runoff in late September, and it didn't work. And one of the reasons it didn't work, and I was talking to a lot of voters down there, even voters that weren't particularly big fans of Roy Moore, but they were very angry at Washington and angry at McConnell. And so they voted for Roy Moore, knowing everything they knew about him at the time. And I guess what I'm trying to present here is the difficult position the Republican Party finds itself in that, 10 or 20 years ago, Allison, if the National Party or major party leaders called for somebody to step aside or even intimated they should step aside, that would carry a lot of weight with voters, and voters might reconsider whether or not they should support somebody, even if it meant the candidate from the other party would win. And that kind of influence just doesn't exist anymore because, especially among Republicans, but I think even among Democrats, voters are so distrustful of what they view as a party establishment that is against them. And that's what Roy Moore is trying to use to his advantage here by trying to write this off as an establishment attack on his character to derail somebody like him who's going to challenge them from getting here. I spoke yesterday to Dean Young, Roy Moore's close friend for the last 25 years and a political advisor. He told me they expect more attacks to come, one way or the other, that they're prepared for them. Dean Young categorically denied that anything happened, said he spoke to Roy Moore about it.
But it depends on the kind of attacks. Depends on the kind of attacks. I mean, there's reporting out there now about his son, who now I think is about 27 years of age, and a number of arrests that he's had. First of all, it's the guy's kid. The kid isn't on, he's an adult, I guess, but he's not on running. And some of them seem to be addiction related. That's something that deserves discretion from the media and others. This is not that. And Karen, so that's where we find ourselves with this, is how much should this matter? The fact that he was in his 30s versus where he is now, should that be relevant in the consideration of the materiality of the criticism?
Well, I guess it depends on the voter that you're talking about. With these sorts of incidences, though, you want to see, especially somebody, again, who's running on a platform and has made his career on, making moral judgments on many things. You want to see somebody like that at least come clean and not try to bury the accusations of several people who are victims, really, of what he had done at a younger age. I mean, some voters are going to say, yeah, it happened a long time ago, it doesn't count right now. But again, when you're making voting judgments, yes, you're doing it based on a person's policies, but you're also doing it based on a person's character, and how they handle something that comes up from 40 years ago in their past is also somewhat of a testament to their character. And again, in this day and age right now, I mean, if we were having this conversation maybe 20 years ago, you'd say, oh, well, that's just a different place and time, because we were not in the middle of this firestorm of a discussion nationally about sexual assault, about taking the that women who come forward with these accusations credibly, I mean, there's a very important paragraph in that Washington Post story that almost pre-refutes what the rebuttal has been from the Roy Moore campaign, which is that these women are Republicans. We found them. They did not come to us. This is not standard opposition research. So that's important to take into account. And more people, I think, probably are because of the context in which it's happening at this time.
It's a dangerous play for Bannon. Bannon is out there saying that this is just dirty politics. It's one thing to say he was dating women of an age of consent. 16 is the legal age of consent. So 18 in Alabama. 18, okay. Then that's, you know, how do I feel about it kind of question.
Right, that's different.
But 14 and touching a 14-year-old is very different. That's not a political attack. It's a potential criminal allegation.
Karin Demerjian, David Drucker, John Hammontree, thank you very much. So this headline is another distraction of the president's overseas trip. The White House says now that there will be no formal meeting with President Trump and Vladimir Putin. However, they might see each other on the sidelines, have some sort of informal interaction. So we try to get to the bottom of what is happening next.
So are Trump and Putin going to meet or not? There are all these conflicting signals now. It's now being called a possible meeting between the president of the United States and the Russian president. The two are attending the Asia-Pacific summit in Vietnam, but it's unclear if there's going to be some kind of face-to-face. And the question is, why? Why is this still uncertain? It had been seen as a certainty up until about 15 hours ago. CNN's Jeff Zeleny live at the conference in Vietnam with more. What's your take?
Good morning, Chris. Well, the White House says it's off. The Kremlin says it's on. But it's this uncertainty over this face-to-face meeting that's actually shining an even brighter light on that Russian controversy that's still hanging over this White House.
A highly anticipated encounter between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, under negotiation for days, is awash in confusion this morning. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders telling reporters a scheduling conflict will prevent a formal meeting, although the two leaders could still cross paths.
Are they going to bump into each other and say hello? Certainly possible and likely, but in terms of a scheduled formal meeting, there's not one on the calendar. We don't
Just today,
anticipate that there will be one.
Yet Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said a meeting would take place one way or another, adding that the White House is making conflicting statements. The president's 13-day trip to Asia continues to be overshadowed by a series of events at home, including developments in the Russia investigation, which is growing even closer to the Oval Office. Senior policy advisor Stephen Miller, seen here with the president aboard Air Force One, has been interviewed as part of special counsel Robert Mueller's probe. Sources close to the investigation tell CNN. Miller is the highest-ranking aide still working at the White House, known to have spoken to investigators. His role in the firing of FBI Director James Comey was among the topics discussed as part of the inquiry into possible obstruction of justice, a source told CNN. The president's longtime confidant, who delivered the letter of Comey's dismissal to FBI headquarters, Keith Schiller, also wrapped up in the investigation. Schiller testified behind closed doors to the House Intelligence Committee this week that he rejected a Russian offer to send 5 women to Trump's hotel room during his 2013 visit to Moscow for the Miss Universe pageant. Schiller told House members he took the offer as a joke, sources told CNN, and Mr. Trump, then a private citizen, laughed it off. The president remaining focused on a series of priorities here in Da Nang, amplifying his call to confront North Korea's nuclear ambitions, and again pledging that his administration would do what his predecessors did not, and close the trade imbalance with countries like China.
I am always going to put America first, the same way that I expect all of you in this room to put your countries first.
So with all these distractions, it may be a perfect time for the president to be out of town, focused on the matters at hand here. But about that meeting between President Putin and President Trump, the two leaders are going to be at least near each other at a dinner that's happening in a short period of time here this evening in Da Nang. What they're trying to do, certainly the White House is trying to lower expectations for anything big to come out of this meeting. But I can tell you, Chris and Allison, this conference is in a pretty small location. Only, a couple dozen country leaders here. No doubt they're going to run into each other. The question is, will it be a formal sit-down meeting? The White House says no. Chris and Allison.
The Kremlin says yes. Welcome to reality. All right, Jeff Zeleny, thank you very much. Let's bring back Karin Demerjian And let's bring in counterterrorism analyst Phil Mudd. We have some very big headlines right now. We have these developments in the Russia investigation. We have the development that they interviewed the White House aide Stephen Miller about the Comey firing.
Senior policy advisor.
So that is all being reported out. Let's figure out its significance. Phil Mudd, talking to Stephen Miller, what does that mean to you? What does it indicate?
Look, you got to understand the timing of this. The timing is critical. He's got to know about critical issues in the investigation, including the circumstances surrounding the Comey firing. But here's why I raised the issue of timing. Just a couple of weeks ago, we have the Mueller team indicting a few people, including Papadopoulos, for lying to federal agents. When you're going into this meeting as Steve Miller, you've got a couple of questions to ask. Number one, how much does the Mueller team know about what I know? And second, most significantly, if I make a mistake, if I lie, the Mueller team has now proven that they will bring what's called a 1001 charge, that is a lying to a federal officer. When you look at the initial Mueller charges, Chris, look at the timing. They come right before the conversations with senior White House officials. What does that tell me? The message to those White House officials is, if you think this is a joke, if you think you can shuck and jive around critical questions about what you knew, if you lie, we'll give you a federal charge that'll last with you throughout your entire life. Pretty serious conversation in the White House.
One quick point on this. The president keeps saying, I'm not under investigation. It's not about me. It's not about me. Phil, what's your take on, if they're talking to Stephen Miller about the firing of Comey, unless it's just idle curiosity, isn't that proof that they are investigating the circumstances surrounding Comey's dismissal? Ergo, they are investigating that situation, which means the president is under investigation by extension of his role in that.
Why the heck would anybody care what the White House says about who's under investigation? They don't run the investigation. The way this game works is you follow the facts where they go. Clearly, the Mueller team has not picked up every fact they can in the investigation. They still have interviews underway. So as the White House says we're not under investigation, someone like me looks at this and says, look, if the Mueller team finds out something in a future interview that implicates somebody in the White House, they're going to drop a federal charge on him. So I'd ignore what the White House says and watch the investigation instead.
So, Karin, Stephen Miller is the highest advisor to the president that we know of to have been interviewed by Mueller. Miller and Mueller are very similar, by the way.
Yes.
But here's who else we know at the moment. Stephen Miller, Reince Priebus, Sean Spicer, Keith Kellogg. So, I mean, what do you glean from that roster?
I mean, it shows that Mueller is moving closer and closer towards Trump's inner circle, and that this makes sense. I mean, this is how investigations go. You talk to people at the periphery first, you build up your case, you move in. I mean, Mueller started also with allegations that he already had, basically he inherited about Manafort's financial issues, and started with that as well. But basically, it's moving from the outer circles into the center, and it's doing so very deliberately. The fact that you're talking to Stephen Miller, who's been quite influential through all about policy planning, about all strategizing of the Trump team through many months, not just of the pre-presidential term, but he's still there, means that he's got the continuity. When you talk to people like Reince Priebus and Sean Spicer, I mean, they don't necessarily still have the same allegiances to the White House as Stephen Miller would right now, but Stephen Miller has to think, if Mueller's talking to a whole bunch of other people, how loyal is he going to be? Because everybody has to worry about both that, but themselves as well, especially because Mueller is showing that he's not going to be pulling punches at all in this investigation when he has them.
And just to be clear, being interviewed by the FBI is not proof of wrongdoing, but it is proof of what and who is being investigated. And that's why it's relevant, absolutely, regardless of what comes out in the interviews. Now, something that could be proof of wrongdoing is what's being reported this morning in the Wall Street Journal and has been reported in part previously by CNN. Phil Mudd, having Mike Flynn, not just in September before the election, but in December after the election, after being named as the National Security Advisor, meeting, the suggestion is, according to the Wall Street Journal, for a potential fee to remove a cleric that is a legal resident of the United States back to Turkey. What is your read on that?
This looks like a mirror of what we saw a couple weeks ago, again, in the initial indictments, when one of the indictments relates to relationship with a foreign power. This is Paul Manafort and non-declaration of money. That is, non-declaration of income overseas and the tax implications of that in the United States.
This is a lot more than that. This
Yeah,
would be
but
working with a foreign actor to remove a legal resident from the United States while an officer of the state.
That's right. I think there are a couple of issues at play here. Number one, you've got to look at the financial relationship that he has, that is General Flynn has overseas. And the second, as you're suggesting, is even more serious. Whether there is a conversation about U.S. policy that stemmed from a financial relationship that General Flynn has overseas. I think what you're finding, Chris, here is the reason this investigation is taking so long. We're seeing this snapshot of something General Flynn did. We're seeing something that happened in Moscow 4 years ago. We saw earlier this year the fact that that Donald Trump Jr. wasn't entirely trustworthy about his conversations with the Russian lawyer. We're seeing 1% of an investigation that spans years. And that's why this is taking so long, piecing all this together.
Access Hollywood tape. Okay, so what's his point? He says the media is behind all of it. That's next.
All right, we're seeing a battle between political value and morality play out in real time. President Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is claiming that the media is targeting Alabama GOP Senate nominee Roy Moore amid accusations of sexual assault and misconduct. Bannon is drawing comparisons to coverage of President Trump's Access Hollywood tape to make his case. Take a listen.
But it's interesting. The Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post that dropped that dime on Donald Trump is the same Bezos, Amazon, Washington Post that dropped the dime this afternoon on Judge Roy Moore. Now, is that a coincidence? That's what I mean when I say opposition party, right? It's purely part of the apparatus of the Democratic Party. They don't make any bones about it.
So you bring out the president or then candidate's own words and ask him to account for them, and that's being oppositional? If so, good. Let's bring in CNN senior media correspondent Brian Stelter and CNN political commentator Alice Stewart. One of the first assertions, Brian, that's being made here is timing. It is anything but unusual for heavy hitting to come the closer you are to an election. The intensity turns up. The efforts turn up. This is routine. To make it suspicious is just misleading.
Some of these right-wing media defenders, I don't know how they can possibly sleep at night. And I wonder if they're going to look back years from now and regret some of the things they're saying, some of the reactions to this story.
Let's play that, because some of the things they're saying is we don't know all the details yet. That's true. Some of the details the narrative that they keep hitting is you got to look at the timing, you got to look at the timing. So listen to this last night on Fox News.
Year-old girl, we have a tendency to believe what we want to believe and disbelieve what we don't want to believe. The classic example is, of course, Bill Clinton in the Oval Office. We didn't believe the Paula Jones and all the rest.
The one serious allegation is a woman, at the time, she was 14 years old, who claims, actual molestation. And who knows? I'd like to see what his response is. But you can't help thinking about the timing.
What do you hear?
I think Ann Coulter should read the full story on WashingtonPost.com, read it a second time, and then come on television and talk about it. Because these commentators, the Steve Bannons, the Sean Hannitys, they'd rather talk about the media than the alleged molestation. That's a much more convenient topic for them. But I think everybody sees through it. That they'd rather talk about the press, blame the Washington Post. The reality is, as you were saying, Chris, as reporters look into all Senate candidates as the race, as election day nears, this is what happens. The Washington Post reporters were not out looking for this information. They were actually out profiling Roy Moore, talking with voters when they started to hear about these rumors. These rumors had existed in Alabama political circles for years. The Washington Post stumbled upon it, didn't seek it out, and eventually was able to convince these reluctant sources to speak on the record.
30 of them, by the way. 30 sources are cited in their reporting.
Right, 4 women and then corroboration of these women accounts and then other sources on top of
So the whole if true
check
thing.
the schedule.
Yeah, but that's why the if true thing bothers me. Because,
how much more do you need?
Right, an allegation is a suggestion without proof. That's what that word means in the law. Their word, their accusation is proof. right? I mean, that it's being ignored.
Well, I mean, but it's not proof, right? I mean,
sure, if a woman comes forward and says this happened, yeah, someone coming forward with testimony is evidence. You could have other evidence. You can vet them. You can impeach their character. You can do other things in terms of the legal process. But if you come forward and say, this person did this to me, that counts.
So, Alice, I know that you spoke with Roy Moore's campaign spokesperson. What's their attitude towards all of this?
They're being very sensitive to the women out there, but they were quite stunned and shocked by the allegations. They say they're not true. They say they're going to fight them vigorously. They have sent a strongly worded letter to the Washington Post outlining the inaccuracies throughout the piece and saying that they were defaming Judge Moore, and they're going to fight this vigorously. He says this didn't happen, and they plan to continue to stay in the race, fight this vigorously. What they're going to do is they are highlighting the fact that, yes, this is a November surprise. Their attitude and their fight back is to say this is more of the Clinton-Obama machine. This is fake news. This is the media attacking a Christian conservative candidate, and he is not going down without a fight. And let me just say this with regard to the comparison to President Trump and the Access Hollywood tape. Like, that is different in that we heard with our own ears the disgusting words out of President Trump's mouth, and it is unequivocal that that was inappropriate and uncalled for. And while what were the allegations in this case are very disturbing, this is nearly 40 years ago, we don't know with absolute certainty that they did happen. The judge denies them, says it didn't happen. So until we get to the bottom of this, until he either comes out and says, yes, this is true, or we have some kind of proof that these are true, I think it's important for us to give him the benefit of the doubt, let him stay in the race, let him fight, and let it be up to the people of Alabama. Let them decide if they want him to be their senator.
Totally. That's the point of the reporting, right? Is the Washington Post wants people to know these allegations, wants these women to be able to have a voice, and then the voters can decide.
But Alice, were you saying that it was your sense that the campaign was trying to be sensitive to the accusers?
Sure, and they understand how they understand the sensitive nature of what they're coming forward with, so they are being careful with regard to how they do respond to this and making sure at the same time that Judge Moore is treated fairly in this race. Look, my first job in television news was in Dothan, Alabama, in South Alabama, and I can tell you that people down there, they get their news from local news sources. They are not going to base their decision on the leader in the Senate for their state based on some national news
So, Alice,
stories.
as the Democratic candidate had a story come out today that we found a 14-year-old young woman at the time, now much older, okay? So the candidate was much younger, just like in the Roy Moore story. And she said, well, now that you got me, and told this story. Would you feel the same way about it? That, boy, you know, this Democratic candidate, let's give him every benefit of the doubt, and let's see if there's any other proof other than this woman reluctantly coming forward and saying, when I was 14, he touched me here, he touched me there, and I asked him to take me home. I was very uncomfortable. I wanted it to end. Would you be so open-minded?
I'm taking politics out of this. I
don't know how you can, because every comment that's made by people on the right is defending and putting in context of political utility. Well, let's see if it's true. Well, boy, the timing is suspicious. These are not things that you say when you're being sensitive to the women in the case. They just are not.
Look, I'm taking politics out of it. It doesn't matter to me if he's Republican, Democrat, or Independent. These are fresh allegations, fresh charges, and here's a man who has run for office 4 times. He's been in the national spotlight for decades, and now all of a sudden these charges come to light.
Women don't want to talk about this because it's scary to say things like this.
Up for a bigger job.
You get judged and you get condemned, just like Allison had all these women talking about on the town hall last night, and we're seeing it play out in real time, that it's being seen as a media trick. And that, you know, we have to vet the claims. You can't just believe women.
And Roy Moore himself, I mean, he tweeted this, Alice, I just want to read it to you. The forces of evil will lie, cheat, and steal, even inflict physical harm if they believe it will silence and shut up Christian conservatives like you and me. I mean, that doesn't sound like sensitivity to the accusers.
That kind of language certainly is not sensitive to the women who put their stories out there, but I can tell you, based on what they have told me, they're going to push back. They're going to stand firm on these against these charges and make sure that people understand that he says he's innocent, and
that's true, and that's his right. That's his right to do. And
they see that President Trump, by not backing down when the tape came out, it benefited President Trump, right? Some of the liberal Hollywood celebrities that have apologized for various wrongdoing, it has sank their careers. I think Roy Moore is looking at that and noticing that. But to call this fake news, I mean, for goodness sakes, he married a much younger woman. There's a lot in this story. It is a very detailed story, and I hope that people that are trying to rip the story apart actually read it.
Imagine if you flip the parties. If you flip the parties and the defenders, then what does it look like? But Alice, I appreciate you speaking to it. It's important to have your voice here this morning.
All right, thank you.
Brian, thank you.
Thanks.
So an Arctic blast is ushering in the first taste of winter here in the Northeast. How long will it last? I'm guessing winter. Allison Chinchar, let's bring in Allison.
Your new day weather, brought to you by Humana. At Humana, we think great things are ahead of you when your health is ready for them.
Millions of people in the Northeast waking up to bitter cold temperatures. Some could even see snow ahead of Thanksgiving. CNN meteorologist Allison Chinchar has our forecast. What do you see, Allison?
Well, it's all thanks to a high pressure system, Alice, and that's going to take care of both the snow showers as well as the incredibly cold temperatures. Now, that forecast is brought to you by Humana. Start with healthy. So we are going to start with the snow showers. You can see some of them in the Midwest, also into the Northeast, and some of them are being enhanced by that lake effect. But in most cases, you're going to be looking at just about an additional 2 inches of snow, so nothing crazy. But that high pressure system is also going to pull down that incredibly cold air from Canada. Take a look at Chicago. Normal would be 51. We're only going to be 32 today. Atlanta, 66 is the average. We'll barely make it to 50 Sunday. And then in addition to that, over 40 possible record lows Saturday morning.
All right, Allison, appreciate it. So we are on the eve of Veterans Day. So it is always important, but especially now, to remember America's military members for their service to this country. They are the ones securing our rights against enemies abroad. We have the VA Secretary, David Shulkin, joining us next. Tomorrow is Veterans Day, and lately we've been talking a great deal about American service members, but not for good reason. The Texas church killer was discharged from the Air Force for bad conduct, and an investigation is underway into the deaths of 4 soldiers killed in an ambush in Niger. Joining us now is the Veterans Affairs Secretary, Dr. David Shulkin. How are you doing, sir?
Hey, good morning, Chris. How are you?
Let's just start with general. How do you think you're doing? There's been so much attention on the VA and getting services up to par and helping our troops more when they come back home, whether they need certain health care or other services. How do you think you're doing in making that situation better?
Chris, I stepped into this job knowing that there was a lot of work to do, that we're dealing with a system that has had decades of issues spanning multiple administrations, so this is not a political issue. But what we're doing is we're tackling those issues and we're transforming the system to be a modern system that responds to the needs of the veterans. And I think we're on our way, and thankfully we're doing it in a bipartisan way, so we're getting work done here in Washington.
Right, and we'll stay on you about it because they deserve our help. Everybody says they support the troops, but as you well know, that commitment doesn't always follow through the way it should. So let's talk about some of the things in the news here.
Sure.
What happened with this shooter in Texas? He was dismissed from the military for bad conduct, but it wasn't a dishonorable discharge. He retained rank. He was demoted, but he retained rank. And it seems as though they did not report his domestic violence, and they did not report that he was put into an institution for his mental health, allegedly escaped. And that was all not in the records. And the investigations of the military show that there's reporting of relatively few of these types of incidents. What does it mean to you? It certainly mattered in his ability to get a gun in this case, but what's your concern?
There's no question that we need to do much better when it comes to reporting. We're dealing with the public safety, not only of our fellow troops, but also of citizens, as we can see. The VA, of course, does carefully track the discharge status of all transitioning service members. And as you know, with a bad conduct disorder, he would not be taken care of by the VA. And
so not just dishonorable, but even the next level down of bad conduct also would exempt him from care?
Yes, that's correct.
But the military did put him into the facility he escaped from, right?
Yes, that's true.
So how do you reconcile those two? He's not subject to care, but he was put into care by the military.
Well, there are systems for care And as a physician, of course, I believe everybody deserves to get access to care.
And you extended it to those that weren't even immediately eligible. You extended the eligibility during your tenure.
Yeah, Chris, it's a very confusing if you're not from the military culture. There are many levels of discharge. About 85% of active service members will leave with a honorable discharge. But about 15% will either have what's called other than honorable, which is not a conviction of a crime the way that this gentleman had a crime, but it really is a behavioral issue. And many of those issues are related to conditions that servicemen and women had during conflict, like post-traumatic stress. So we have extended emergency mental health services for those who have other than honorable, but for bad conduct or dishonorable discharge, which are really much more serious offenses, we do not provide services for